You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. October the 11th, 1973. And for two men, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, life would never be the same again. What occurred that night in Pascagoula has become one of the most compelling alleged examples of alien abduction in modern history. Since Calvin Parker came out of his self-imposed exile back in 2016, more witnesses have come forward and more evidence has been uncovered to support and add to the events of that night. Now, Dr. Irena Scott's new book, Beyond Pascagoula, shows that this event was simply the tip of the iceberg. UFO sightings were reported all over the USA. A mysterious boom terrified residents across several states on the same night as the Pascagoula incident, and others also had encounters, as well as the US Coastguard coming into close contact with a USO. It seems much more was going on across the United States, and Dr. Scott tells us all about it on this week's Mysteries and Monsters. Before we get there, you can also support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up for Patreon. For $4 a month, you'll get ad-free episodes, early access, and more. The link is in the show notes, or you can go to patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. Mysteries and Monsters is also on all social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also now get Mysteries and Monsters merchandise by visiting mysteriesandmonsters.com and clicking the tabs at the top of the page. As always, artwork for the show is by Dean Bestall. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be part of the Straight Up Strange network. So, let's uncover more of these strange events that surround the Pascagoula incident in the company of Dr. Irena Scott. October 1973, and what started as a quiet nighttime fishing trip became an event that changed the lives of both Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker forever. In the last few years, Calvin finally came forward to open up about that night, and much more besides, and this has led him to a slew of new information, witnesses, and much more. In her new book, Beyond Pascagoula, Dr. Irena Scott looks at the ramifications of this event and the myriad of additional information that has come to light. Dr. Scott, welcome back. It's been too long.
Yes, it has, and thank you very much for having me.
You are very welcome. So first of all, how are you doing and how have you been keeping?
Just fine. Maybe everybody else is bothered by COVID, but I've been working on books and things, so I've been busy.
Yeah, well, I think research and keeping your nose in books and into articles and typing away is probably a surefire way of keeping things at bay, I suspect.
I didn't even notice it, hardly.
Well, I think, to be fair, that's probably a good thing after everything that's been going on, so I'm glad to hear it. So, obviously, you were one of my very first guests back in the early summer of 2019, Irena, and obviously we were talking about some of your work. I mean, you've had a long interest in ufology, and it's quite remarkable, really. It's probably the best part of 5 decades. And it's almost as if Pascagoula seems to be one of those incidents now that seems to bear very little resemblance to what actually occurred at the time, despite how widespread the coverage was.
Yeah, there's a lot more information about it, surprisingly enough. Well, it's not surprising because I think people were inhibited from talking about things back then, and they're finally, with all the things that happened recently, they're more free to talk about it, so we're getting information from some of the witnesses that never said anything back in that day.
And without wishing to sound churlish or be presumptuous about anybody that may be listening to our conversation, Irena, could you just give me a brief synopsis of what happened to Charles and Calvin that night for anybody who's not aware of this incredible case?
Okay, this is probably one of the best known abduction cases of all. And it started out with two normal people. These weren't UFO people, you might say, or nuts or anything like that. They were just shipyard workers. And the older man was about 45 and the younger man was 18 or 19. And his father was a friend of the older man and vice versa. So they were family friends, and the families had known each other a long time. After their day of work, they decided to go fishing, which lots of people do, and especially people down in Mississippi by the coast. So they tried several places and didn't find many fish. And then they went to this other place that was kind of marked no trespassing or something. And they were in the younger man's car. And so he was kind of nervous about it. And he told the older man if they get in trouble, that he's going to jail, not him. But anyway, they went out on a pier and began fishing. Then they saw this blue light coming, and they interpreted that as the police. And they were nervous, but then this turned out to be much, 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 much worse than any police they could imagine, because it was UFO. It was a blue light, and it was hovering about 2 feet off the ground, and then something opened, and this very bright light came out, and 3 things came out. 2 of them, they were humanoid-like, and 2 of them grabbed Charles Hickson, the older man, and 1 grabbed Calvin Parker. And they were like a normal man would be. They would fight back and everything, but they couldn't. They were both just like they'd received a shot or something, and paralyzed and couldn't care less, even though they were terrified. The things took him into the object and gave the presentation of scanning them, and then took him back out. I guess Calvin, when he was taken back out, he was just standing there with his arms up in the air and couldn't move. And then Charles tried to get him out of his state, and he collapsed. And they were both just absolutely terrified beyond anything you could imagine. And so they discussed what to do in a terrified way and decided not to tell anybody. But the older man had been in life and death situations. He'd been in the Army in Vietnam and had been in really bad situations. And so he thought they should report it. The younger man didn't want to do anything. He just wanted to forget about it. And so the older man, they contacted, first of all, a newspaper, and the newspaper was closed. Then they contacted the local Air Force Base, and the Air Force Base said that it was late at night, said that they don't take UFO reports anymore. Project Blue was closed.
Yeah.
And so then they said to contacted local authority. So they contacted the police, and you can imagine how scary that would be, because you'd expect the police to say you're crazy or something. The older man called and said, "You're not going to believe this, but we were abducted." And somehow the police, I interviewed a policeman from farther away, and he said that something went out saying that they'd picked up 2 drunks that said they were abducted by UFOs, and so they didn't take it real seriously. But the person who talked to Charles said that in the background he could hear Calvin crying and pleading not to report it and things, and he took that seriously. Then they took him into the police station and interviewed him separately and put him together and interviewed him. And then the police person left the room and let him talk, so that they could talk to themselves. Well, what they didn't know was that there was a tape recorder hidden in the room with him. And later they retrieved the tape recorder. And the police thought, they were hoaxers and that they would just say, well, we really put one over on them. But that's not what happened. Instead, the 2 men were just terrified. And Calvin said he thought he died, and he was praying and things like that, and just beyond themselves. And so that caused them to have a lot more credibility, and the police believed them. And so due to the credibility and that there were 2 people and things like that, it made the news all over the world real fast. And that's the basic story.
Yeah, I remember the first time I heard that recording, because as you say there, Irena, it is incredible on 2 levels, really, because I think it was quite clever of the police officers to suspect, rightly or wrongly, that these 2 gentlemen were just pulling their leg. They were trying to have some fun, which is one of those things that it's a bit strange for somebody to sort of claim something like this had gone on, because it's a very unusual hoax to kind of pull, especially in that kind of area. It doesn't really have a history of such situations, really, and it seemed a bit unusual. But clearly they thought, well, we'll catch them out wherever. And I think if you've ever heard that recording, for me, that is just some of the most compelling evidence I've ever heard of anybody who's claimed to have suffered such an incident as this, Irena, because you can hear just how scared Calvin is, and Charles, bless him, is trying to remain calm and calm Calvin down more than anything, I think. And I think if you hear that, it's very, very clear that something terrifying had happened to those two men.
Yeah, and they had this clip way of talking to each other. Like if they were hoaxing, they'd probably explain something or something. Well, they didn't. They just talked in a natural way as two terrified people that were really been into something. And I think Charles acted kind of fatherly toward Calvin, who was absolutely terrified. I mean, they both were.
I think it's one of those things as well, the ramifications of how it affected both of them, as you mentioned there in your summing up of the incident. A lot of people do think that because Charles had been a soldier and he had been in extremely perilous situations, he was able to deal with what happened far more balanced. But as you say, Calvin was a very young man. All he knew was school, work, fishing. That was basically his life, wasn't it? And to suddenly find yourself caught in the middle of this maelstrom of madness, I mean, it did deeply affect him, because obviously Calvin kept quiet for the best part of 40 years over the whole thing, because he saw what went on, and because obviously Charles was very upfront and quite open about the incident, and continued to do so until he passed away a few years ago. But I think, do you think that was the reason why Calvin eventually decided to come forward, that he'd had enough of hiding away?
I think he wanted to live a normal life. He didn't want to be, a UFO freak or something like that. He just wanted to be normal and have kids and grandkids and everything. And so there was a whole lot of harassment, and, people I interviewed told me about how people harassed him. But, I think that what caused him to come forward was that he'd been hiding for all these years, and that once they went to a funeral, I think, and Calvin used his real name, and people recognized him and came up, but they weren't harassing. They were friendly to him. They were concerned about him. They wanted to know what happened and things. And then his wife thought, that they were older and there was a better view of UFOs and they should come forward. And I think she and Philip Mantle, who found out about it, convinced him that it would be better for him to talk about it. And he does think so now, but he wasn't in the framework for quite a while, many, many years. I
think as well, he was probably sick to death of other people telling the story and getting it wrong as well. Because obviously I remember reading about it in the 80s and 90s, Irena, and, the versions I've read then clearly aren't based on what really happened. They seem a bit far-fetched. I mean, that's the thing about it. Calvin's always very matter-of-fact about it. He doesn't make it sound fantastical. He's just very straight as a die. I think that's the kind of person he is, and the upbringing he had, and the area he grew up in, and the area he's lived in. And I've seen him a few times interviewed on quite a few programmes these days, because I think you can't do a show about UFOs and not speak to Calvin these days, really, Irena.
Uh-huh.
I know he was saying recently that his neighbours or something were talking about UFOs, and they mentioned Pascagoula, and they didn't know he was Calvin Parker, and because he'd never told them, he'd used a different name for so many years, hadn't he?
Yeah, and that's how that's how people finally discovered him. He actually signed his real name someplace, and he found out that rather than being criticized, people were interested and concerned about him, that sort of thing, which made, him and his wife feel better about it.
Yeah, I suppose it's very interesting as well, because obviously, as you mentioned, Blue Book had allegedly been shut down. Obviously, what they said and what went on, I think, are two very different things, Irena, because they were clearly still collecting reports somewhere, somehow. Whether it was an official channel or not, then I think we all know everything that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years, that we should take anything they say in regards to the reporting of UFOs with a great pinch of salt, really, especially if it comes from the US Air Force, I suspect. But clearly there is a far more open and honest conversation that goes on about these situations. And I think Calvin's probably timed it just right, that he's able to be himself now and just tell his story knowing that people are going to listen to him and take him seriously and look into it.
Well, that's what happened with Philip Mantle, the publisher. He, as a publisher, he wants to get everything with the English and everything correct. But Calvin wanted to put it in his own words, and he's not a professional writer. But Philip was happy to let him do that, even though, I might reflect on him. And so that worked out very well, because Calvin got to write it in his own words and, say exactly what happened and not have, somebody paraphrase him or anything.
Yeah. So obviously Calvin's done 2 books, and Philip's obviously been a massive driving force in bringing this story to the forefront of modern ufology, and for us all to sort of look back at this in open-mouthed wonderment at what went on that night. At what point were you instructed to, or asked to join in, Irena, and do some digging and a bit of detective work in regards to everything else that went on? Because at the end of the day, as incredible as this incident is, it's clearly just the tip of the iceberg that was going on at that period of time in certain states in the US.
Well, I got involved in 2 ways. One was that Philip had published one of my books, and he was then getting other witnesses for the Pascagoula abduction. And he's in England, has an English accent and everything. And he wanted somebody for the United States to call and, interview people. And I could, record the interviews and things. And so I was happy to do it. But I had a very long-term interest in the thing for another reason. And that's because something happened in my family at the same time. And I had been working on another aspect of the thing, the same UFO flap as that. This happened, his abduction happened on October 11th, 1973. And something happened to me then, too.
Yeah.
I was at the University of Missouri working on my PhD, and my mother was in Ohio, about 600 miles away. And for some reason that night, she called and said, "Did you hear a noise?" And started teasing her and, saying, we're 600 miles away. And, so I gave her a hard time. And then later, she was a real skeptic. That's why I gave her a hard time. And then later she said that they were having a huge UFO flap in Ohio, and that people were staying in and keeping their kids in and not going out at night. It was just like a war zone. And then I wasn't living in Ohio, and I didn't pay attention to it for quite a few years. But later I moved back to Ohio, and I was working at Ohio State University, and they had a newspaper room with real actual newspapers in it. And one day on impulse, I decided to go in and see if I could find when that noise was, or the flap or anything else. And so I walked into the newspaper room, and there was zillions of papers. It was huge. And I didn't remember the date, but I thought it was around the middle of October in 73. And so there were a lot of papers in the middle of October then. But I got some local ones, and I found it real fast, a little tiny note on the strange sound. And for some reason, that just interested me, because it seemed like it was something concrete with UFOs. And so I started doing a little bit of research on it. And then I was going to publish that in a scientific journal and submitted. And the state of Ohio seismologist contacted me, and he was interested in it too, and helped me find some information and that sort of thing. And so I published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal many years later. But I did a lot of research, and what was interesting was that sound had occurred just about as well as you can connect it at the same time as the Pascagoula abduction, which is kind of interesting. It was like something happened to us both at the same time. I mean, mine was very, very mild, and his was horrible.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I was not aware of until I read your book, Irena, that this mysterious sound seems to have been heard across hundreds and thousands of miles all across the US. And I know you refer to the fact that it's possibly the most widely heard sound since Krakatoa back in 1883. So this was actually recorded by scientific instruments as well, wasn't it?
2 seismographs. So it should be in the scientific literature or something, because it was recorded on 2 seismographs that were about 135 miles apart.
Was there any explanation ever given at that time, Irene, or was it just one of those things that they went, oh, well, that's a bit strange, and just left it?
Well, they basically left it. When it happened, they first of all, what was happening, they explained it as a airplane, the SR-71, which is a real super fast airplane. They don't fly it anymore, but it was like 3 times the speed of sound, or even more than that. That's the first thing they explained it as, and they admonished the pilots for making such a big boom and everything. But by the next day, they had analyzed it, and the sound was way larger than should come from an airplane. And then they passed it off as some type of meteor, like an Earth-grazing meteor. But it seemed like everybody just forgot about it after that and didn't do anything. And as far as I know, I'm not the only person that picked it up and went to work on it. Later, although when I first started, I'd contacted scientists, and they always say scientists are debunkers. Well, the scientists I contacted were quite interested in it, and I didn't really connect it with UFOs and trying to find out what it was. But later, I published in the MUFON Journal, which is a UFO magazine, and that's where I got a debunker. And the debunker said it was an SR-71, and he wrote an article about it. And then I debunked him, because I didn't have too much material or understand it too much, but I debunked him a little bit by saying the sound was where the airplane was. But later, like today, when I went through and did the research again, you can get a lot of newspapers on the internet. And so I could trace this sound all the way across the United States, halfway across the United States, by the newspaper articles, and get, more detailed information. And also NASA had published more recently information about sonic booms and how high an airplane has to be and how big their sonic boom is and things like that. So I could also use that information, and I could do a better job of debunking my debunker on that, which I did.
I think the other interesting aspect of this is this sound was heard in a lot of areas where the residents were used to hearing sonic booms, Irena, and as someone that grew up on a flight path in the UK for the RAF, you can, obviously you can hear a sonic boom before you see anything. And a lot of these people who would normally just go, they carried on their lives without any issue. It was like, oh, well, it's just another sonic boom. A lot of people were really frightened by this noise and contacted the authorities and all sorts, didn't they?
The authorities, I think the boom started in Iowa, and the authorities were contacted across the United States, which is not anything normal for a sonic boom. The newspapers had headlines about this boom the next day in all the states right across the country. So this was quite a bit abnormal for a sonic boom, because people just were used to it and heard it. They didn't call the newspapers and police and fire departments and everything else, which they did in this case.
That this whole month seems to be there seems to be so much going on there. It's a real tangle, Irena. This boom is just one of the many aspects. And I was really surprised to see, and I think it's one of those things that you refer to in your book, that there was also a real flap of UFO sightings going on across numerous states. I think there were sightings in Colorado, Tennessee, Iowa. Obviously, there was the incidents in Mississippi. We had a very odd story from Alabama about a young boy who told his mum about a playmate he'd made who seems to bear a striking resemblance to an alien. Oh. And you wonder how a 3-year-old child could make such a story up. So when you started to peel back the layers of these newspaper reports and previous articles and investigations that other ufologists had done, were you surprised that this flap isn't more well known?
Well, some people have said it's the largest flap that ever happened, and it took place in a lot of places beside Pascagoula. For example, in Pascagoula, for that night, the police had reports, formal reports, of 50 UFO sightings, which is an awful lot for one night. But there were a lot more reports they didn't record. But several days later in Columbus, Ohio, there were reports of 150 UFO reports in one night. This was several nights later. But that sounded like a world record. And so there was a big flap all over. And it wasn't just in Pascagoula, which had a lot going on. And we're finding out about Pascagoula because of the abduction and interviewing people that saw things then. But there were a lot of people all over that had that, including like Ohio and the Midwest and a lot of places.
I would suspect, Irena, and obviously as someone that's worked for MILFON for a considerable period of time, I would be amazed if 50 UFO sightings are made a day across America, never mind one particular area.
Yeah, I would too. So I think this was a pretty big flap. And in Wheeling, West Virginia, there were 100 reports in one night. It was the same night as Columbus, Ohio had them. And I guess almost had mass panic. And from what I heard, Leonard Stringfield, who's a famous ufologist from Cincinnati, Ohio, called it a siege. And it was kind of like, like a war or something. And in my book, I called it like a show of force.
It's very easy, I suppose, to kind of postulate that Pascagoula was the epicenter, Irena. But, when we're talking about states like West Virginia and Ohio, they're nowhere near Pascagoula. So one would have to consider, if you look at it and the wider evidence and you look at all the reports that were going on, because it wasn't this one night either, was it? This was going on for several weeks around this period as well, which makes it even more remarkable. And yet, clearly, often people saying debunkers and skeptics will say, oh, well, people have probably heard about it somewhere else and they've all misidentified something. But I find it very hard to believe that somebody in West Virginia is going to read a report about something that's happened in Tennessee, and they're going to have read a report about something that's happened in Alabama, and everybody's misidentifying something. And if they are, then you'll get maybe one person or two people. You won't get reports in the hundreds, surely.
No, and that's one reason I was interested in newspaper reports, because the sound was on the 11th, the abduction was on the 11th. And so I collected news reports on the 12th from as many newspapers as I could find that had anything about it. And there wouldn't be any, media stimulation of reports in that case, because it was the next day.
Yeah.
It wasn't like somebody heard it and reported. They made the newspapers the next day, the sound right across the country. And often it was linked with UFO sightings.
And once again, this is just another aspect of it all, because, as we say, I think once Calvin came forward a couple of years ago, what that seems to have done is been like a snowball effect, because clearly I think a lot of people that night saw something or experienced something very strange and very frightening for some of them. But I think clearly they saw what happened and the whole sideshow that followed Charles and Calvin after the immediate aftermath of the event, Irena. And it seems to me that a lot of people saw what happened to those two and thought, I don't want any part of this, I don't want to be involved. So Calvin coming forward and being so open, do you think that's enabled more people to be open about what happened? And also the fact that Calvin's a very salt of the earth person. He's a humble, quiet man who just wants to tell his story. Do you think a lot of people have seen how he was treated at the time and how he's been since and thought, well, if he can do it, so can I?
Yeah, I think so. And a number of people told me that they saw how he was treated and they kept their mouths shut. But I think it's not something like you to remember what happened to you on the 11th of October in 1973. But a lot of people saw something strange, which they wouldn't remember. And then they also remembered that the next day the newspapers told about the abduction. So they had something to hang it on. I mean, it didn't just fly by in their memory because they could contact a newspaper and see when it happened. So I think that made a lot of difference. And people just didn't want to say anything because of the way Calvin and Charles were treated. But it's a lot more open now. The government has said that there may be things that they don't understand after all these years. They've said that. The New York Times wrote a serious article about it. It's been on 60 Minutes and things. And so there's a more open, respectable view of UFOs now. I mean, some people.
Yeah, we're not there yet, Irene, but we've certainly come a long way, I suspect, from where we were 10 years ago. I think one of the other incredible aspects of this whole story as well is Mr. and Mrs. Blair. And when I heard about this, I just thought this was incredible because essentially, if we are to believe what they say, and these are once again people that have stayed quiet for the best part of 50 years, primarily because of what we've just been saying about the treatment of Calvin and Charles. And yet they were across the river, weren't they, on the opposite bank, and saw something strange, and what they remembered eventually turns out to be not what actually happened to them.
Yeah, the reason we found out was because Calvin had given a speech in Pascagoula, and it was on YouTube, and a person had written in to make a comment on YouTube that their parents were there and saw this happening. And so Philip had contacted them, and I interviewed Maria Blair. And what she said was that, so it didn't come directly from them, it came from one of their kids. So they had obviously discussed it a little bit. And so I interviewed Maria Blair, and she said that she and her husband were in a car on the other side of the Pascagoula River from Charles and Calvin, that they were waiting for a supervisor to come. They were by a pier, and the boat was out at the end of the pier, and they were going to walk out when the supervisor came and he was going to go on the boat and work with his ship or go work with his supervisor. But the supervisor was late, and so they were waiting, and she was looking out the window, and she saw this strange thing flying around, and she didn't know what it was, and she made the comments that this pilot doesn't know where he's going. He's just going up and down and across the river. He doesn't seem to be going anyplace. And, she thought it was very strange and couldn't figure out what he was doing. So then the husband decided to take his clothes to the ship, and they got out to walk down the pier. Well, she said that this thing that looked like a person came out of the water right beside her on the pier, and then went back down and never came up again or to breathe again or anything. And they went on to the ship, and she said it was about 9 o'clock. And then about 12 o'clock, she came back, and she was really scared, and she ran back to the car. And she seemed, there was a little time missing, little time difference there that seems kind of funny. But then she seemed real emotional about the thing that came out of the water. And so I contacted her several times and then wrote to her for a long time. And she seemed real emotional about it. And then she had said her husband was a debunker or whatever, a skeptic, and told her to keep quiet about it and nothing had happened. Don't tell anybody about it and that sort of thing. And so anyway, unfortunately, her husband became very ill and died last year. And before he went on a respirator, he told her that they had been abducted and that he had been on board. Apparently, maybe they both had been. And these things had taken him on board, and they'd been abducted. And then he saw them swimming across the river, and then he saw the UFO fly away. I talked to him for just real shortly before I talked to her, and he said something about a big splash and a blimp. But she had told me, he was skeptical. Well, he was very ill then, and he was afraid he was going to die. And I guess he didn't worry as much about getting debunked or anything or harassed.
Yeah.
But then he went on the respirator and couldn't talk. And so she didn't find out too much more about him, but he talked to her and he talked to Philip Mantle both and said they'd been abducted. Well, what was strange is that the object they saw might have been the same one that got Calvin and Charles, and at about the same time. So it was very, very strange, and maybe the first time anything like that's been reported with UFOs. But, if they got abducted, it was about the same time and place.
It's one of those things as well, Irena, that we often hear this in a variety of phenomena. That when somebody's in a situation, as Mr. Blair was, where he was worried that he may not make it through the operation, because it was quite a serious procedure, I believe, he was going under, that he just wanted to get this off his chest. And I know it's very interesting that a lot of people will look at that and go, well, how can a husband not tell his wife the truth about an event they both experienced for so long? But it was very clear that he could remember what happened and she didn't. And I suspect that because his memory of the event was far clearer and quite possibly far more traumatic, he was simply trying to protect her.
Yeah, being a man, he was, I suppose, I don't know if they were both working or not, but, it'd be more nerve-wracking for him to say something, get harassed because he might lose his job and that sort of thing, I think. And it might be less worrisome for her. But he, said he remembered it. And she never did remember being, as yet, being inside the object. She thinks something's locked away in her mind that, she can't contact. And she's interested in hypnosis, but he's just died and, she's settling down and trying to get over that. So it hasn't been done yet. But he seemed to have a lot more memory, but he was the one that said to keep quiet. But I've interviewed two people, the wives of two people who wouldn't talk about it. One was Calvin and one was Mr. Blair. Didn't talk about it for many, many, many years.
Yeah. Obviously, like you say, I was just about to mention if she'd gone into going forward for some regressional hypnosis, Irena, to kind of see if it can be unlocked in regards to whatever is there. But obviously, we have in a situation like this, you've got a duty of care, haven't you, for these people? And obviously, if she's just lost her husband quite recently, and then the last thing you want to be doing is unlocking something that's clearly been filed in her brain, primarily, I would suspect, to protect her more than anything.
Yeah, she's expressed an interest in it, but I don't think it's quite the time yet, because she's going through a lot of things that happened because her husband died and things like that. And Philip's more into it than me. But it's probably just not the right time yet to do that.
And I think the other aspect of all this is that I think a lot of people this is the other thing that seems to be coming out through all these people coming forwards and these additional witnesses and these news reports and police files and everything, Irena, is that there seems to be a lot of it that seems to be going on around water or even underwater. And this whole incident that involves a father and son on the river and the Coast Guard is remarkable. So what on earth was going on there? Because I think one of the father described it as looking like a parachute under the water, didn't he?
Yeah, that was the other thing that happened. Pascagoula made the national news twice in a month because not only was there the abduction account, but there was also an underwater account, a USO, underwater submarine object. And so it made the national news twice. And the underwater submarine object was witnessed by 16 people. And only one of them is still alive, and I interviewed him. But what happened was that these fishermen, they had their nets out and everything. They were out fishing. And they saw this object underwater. It was lit up. And first of all, it was a father and son, and I interviewed the son. But he said the father was trying to figure out what it was, and he was nudging it and hitting it he had a real long boat oar and was hitting it, and the thing sounded like metal. And if he bothered it a lot, it would turn off its lights and then turn them back on or be someplace else. And then the father's twin and his kids were there, and another family was there, and they all came over and tried to figure out what the thing was. It was like described as like a parachute, and like looking down, ribs going out from it, like looking down on a parachute. And he described it as 30 feet in diameter, but other people described it differently. So it was underwater, and they probably couldn't tell too well. But anyway, he and his father went to get the Coast Guard to find out, to have somebody look at it and see if they could identify. Well, 2 Coast Guard officers came out in a larger boat, and they interacted with it too and nudged it and hit it with oars and everything. And it would go out, and then it might turn on its light and be someplace else. And I asked him if it seemed interactive and whether it seemed to know its way around. And he said, yes, he thought it knew its way around because there was a trench down through the middle of the river. It was deeper, and it seemed to know where the trench was. The Coast Guard 2 people were mystified too, and the Coast Guard man that said that when he held an oar over the light, that it went through the oar like a X-ray instead of the oar casting a shadow, which is pretty weird.
Yeah.
And they never saw it again. But the Coast Guard and the Navy took that very seriously and had them interviewed and everything else because the Coast Guard officers had seen it, for one thing. It was taken seriously because that was a big shipbuilding area. It was Huntington Ingalls Shipbuilding, and that's one of the Navy's largest shipbuilders. There was a nuclear installation there and Kessler Air Force Base. And so there was a lot of really classified government work going on there, and that's one reason they took it seriously. There was a lot going on in the country then, such as Watergate and everything like that, but also there had been a nuclear alert, which nobody knew about until later, but there had been a DEFCON alert for possible nuclear war that was announced several weeks later in October. And that wasn't declassified until recently, but there was a possibility of nuclear war, so there was a whole lot going on with the government and everything at that time, too, at the time of the flap. And probably the Navy was aware of when they investigated the submarine thing. But actually, although people made fun of the abduction, it was closer to the shipbuilding area than the USO event had been, which the government took seriously.
I suppose, like you say, tensions were very high because there was a lot going on in the world, which is often put forward why a lot of people didn't sort of see anything else outside of what was going on in Pascagoula, Irena, and these loud booms and houses being shaken, and I mean there were windows broken across states as well from this noise. It just seems like there was so much going on, and yet because of everything that was happening, I suppose some people would say in the real world, but anything that was happening in the mainstream media, obviously you got tensions rising in the Middle East as well. Nixon was committing political suicide. You'd got other political ramifications and resignations going off at that time. Things were quite tense, so I suspect that it's only when we've got the ability now to look backwards with hindsight and the historical record, Irena, that we can unpick this, because I think often when you get an event such as Pascagoula and what happened with Charles and Calvin, people can often see that in isolation. But I think, as we said earlier on, since Calvin's come forward, there are so many people that have now come out that had strange things. I think one of the creepiest reports that came out was from a lady called Mrs. Robinson, who told the story about her husband. And it didn't happen, immediately around that time, but she thinks it was around within a year of what happened. And she interestingly claimed that her husband had an encounter with something in the sky, and it was only the fact that he wouldn't get out of his car that saved him, she reckons. Well,
there were several things like that. Yeah, she kept saying, well, he wasn't abducted. Because she said that so often.
Yeah.
But that same thing happened to several people. For example, that same night, on the 11th of October, there were people on Dolphin Island, which is at the end of the Pascagoula River when it goes out into the ocean. or the Gulf. These people, I just talked to the cousin, but he said his cousins were out in a dune buggy. I forget what they were doing, but dune buggy got stuck, and they were trying to get it out and dig it out and pull it out, and they couldn't get it out. Well, he said that this object came over them and shone this real bright light on them. It was so bright that they could see colors in the grains of sand, and they were absolutely terrified. And they were so terrified, apparently they lifted the dune buggy up and got it out real fast and left. And they told him about it, and he said he joked about it and everything. And then the next day, the abduction of Calvin and Charles made the papers. And so after that, he kind of believed him. But that was sort of like the same thing that happened to Calvin. First of all, he had this bright light come on him. And the same thing for the people in the dune buggy. And it was like some of the people there just had another close call of almost getting it too.
It's almost as if it was just going around and looking to see who took its fancy.
Well, there were certainly some, reports like that. Usually you get, reports of somebody will say, well, I saw this thing way off in the distance and, maybe it was a UFO. Well, these ones that came from Pascagoula were close, like interactive, scary ones. They weren't like a normal report.
Yeah. And it is quite, I suppose, obviously with your body of experience in the UFO phenomenon, with all your investigations and work, as I mentioned earlier with MUFON, it strikes me, I'm not aware of a similar case where so many people had a close encounter of this visual nature so often. Like I say, it's almost as if it was just circling the area, looking for people to take.
Well, yeah, it was from those reports. It was, and I tried to check and see if other people had reported, similar things at the same time and tried to get the names of any other witnesses. But there was a big flap in Ohio, too. But I don't think anybody reported an abduction. But it makes me kind of wonder if maybe there was a lot more going on there that people didn't report, too. I mean, all through the area where this flap happened.
Yeah, well, I suppose you could say, well, they might not even realize anyway if they had been abducted.
Yeah, because Maria didn't realize that. She was very emotional about it, and you could tell that, but she never thought of being abducted, apparently.
Yeah, I suppose that often takes you into the wider possibility as well then, Irena, that why were Calvin and Charles taken? What made them special? These two guys who'd just gone out for a fishing trip, and the same as the Blairs. What was it about these two sets of people that made them so attractive in comparison to the other people that had a similar encounter that didn't develop as terrifyingly as it did for the others?
Well, I sort of joked that it's because the other people got away, but I don't know, and they don't know either, and so it's unknown why, some people report that and some people don't.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't.
Well, I suppose if we knew why certain people claim to be abducted or why certain people say they've been abducted, that would probably, if we could find out what makes them more attractive to whatever's going on, then I suppose that would answer a lot of questions.
Well, it might just be random, too.
Well, exactly. I think often you can confuse yourself trying to look for a pattern in a phenomenon like this, where it could simply just be bad luck.
Yeah. No, it was pretty weird that, that many people had strange experiences. And, it makes me wonder if there was a lot more experiences like that. For example, that happened on the 11th one, I think the 17th of October. There were a whole lot of humanoid sightings all on that one night and things like that happened that were a little bit strange too.
Yeah. And I suppose it offers up an interesting aspect to this, because often I think when we have an encounter that hits the headlines or gets top billing, as it were, as it did for the main Pascagoula incident, it's very easy, as we've mentioned here, to miss everything else that was going on all around the US, it seems, at that particular period. For whatever reason, these 3 or 4 weeks seem to be a real wave a flap, whatever you want to call it, that seemed to affect different states in different areas of the US. So, we're not even talking about adjacent states. We're talking states that are hundreds of miles apart. And it is interesting that I think it could be really interesting when we look back at some of these well-known cases and look at it in that and kind of cast the net wider, Irena, and have a look and see, well, if this has happened here, did something happen in the next state, or 2 states up, or 2 states down, or something, to see if this isn't so unique. And when we get these big cases, are there other cases that have happened over the years? I'm thinking of the Socorro case primarily because I know Ben Hanson's done a lot of work looking at that one and discovered that around the same period there were some rather strange incidents where people were claiming to see things flying through the sky all around the same time period. So it would be very interesting that if we looked at other notable cases that make the headlines, what are we missing? What haven't we seen that was also going on at the same period? Rather than, is it just this incident with Pascagoula that makes it even more special? Or have we simply just been missing it all along?
Well, yeah, and several people said that maybe Pascagoula was emphasized so much because to cover up everything else that was happening and keep it out of the news.
well, yeah. I suppose, yeah, don't look at all that, look at this.
Yeah. And then, they ridiculed that and didn't report the other things.
Yeah. I think it's also remarkable as well that it's one of those cases where it seems to be quite early on when Hynek's kind of crossed the floor, as it were, and he's gone from being the main chief debunker and explainer of natural phenomenon to kind of coming across and really beginning to think that strange things are coming on, because he was really impressed with Charles and Calvin, wasn't he? And he was convinced that they'd had an encounter.
Yeah, I don't think he ever totally understood UFOs, but he trusted them and said so. And Dr. Harder, who was also a professor, both he and Hynek talked to him and everything else and interviewed him deeply and thought they were both honest people who were telling the truth. He was a professor when he started out. And I remember when I was a kid, I used to read his articles in the paper about astronomy. He was an astronomy professor. And they selected him to be a debunker because when they interviewed him, he said he didn't, think UFOs were real and all that. And also, I think it was because he had a clearance. And so they put him in as a chief debunker. And, whenever anything UFO happened, he said it was Venus or something. Well, then he got in trouble in Michigan and the swamp gas thing.
Yes.
He began to reconsider things. But I think he had a scientific mind, and he began to, actually listen to what people said and talk to them and think they were honest people. And Project Blue Book had closed in 1969. This was 1973. But after Project Blue Book, Dr. Hynek started his own UFO center to study UFO phenomena. He was quite serious about it by that time. And it helped. He had a real good stature as a scientist and a writer, too. And so it certainly helped to have somebody that scientific training that kind of knew their way around science and was doing research and publishing it. I think he became the head of the department at Northwestern of the astronomy department. And so that really made UFOs more respectable in that way, too. Yeah,
definitely. I think, was it Harder that discovered that Charles and Calvin actually had physical marks on them as well?
Well, they had the puncture wound document, and I don't think we've ever figured out exactly who wrote it. But there were wounds on Calvin and Charles, and they thought they had been injected some way because they were, first of all, fighting against these things that were getting them. And then they just both went numb and couldn't, like they were paralyzed and couldn't fight back and everything, like they'd just been given an injection. And so we had people look at some of the pictures of their puncture wounds. They weren't in color or anything. And the ones in Charles just looked like surface, abrasions or something. But Calvin had two, but they were on his feet, which seemed kind of strange. That might have been puncture wounds. But they both had some wounds on them, and they thought they had been injected. But, I think you can give people things without actually injecting them and things. So I don't know exactly what happened, but they said, they were first of all fighting back and then whomp, like they were just been injected. If you're having an operation, they give you something IV and you're just out. They weren't, it wasn't like the regular anesthetic they used back then that put you out, though, because they were conscious the whole time. They just couldn't move.
I mean, there is a lot of this encounter that is quite strange, and it's very different to anything that was reported previously as well, because, as you refer to in the book, people prior to that, the usual encounters tended to be with these kind of greys. And one of the things that's always struck me about this case is the description of the creatures that came out of the craft, and this female creature that was in the craft as well, and this rather stomach churning incident with Calvin where this creature rammed her fingers, or what he assumed to be her fingers, down his throat for some unknown reason. For you, when you look at these kind of cases, Irena, is it interesting that this seems to be vastly different in the descriptions of what was going on in the craft? Because I know you refer to it, it's almost as if they were CAT scanned inside. The descriptions of the creatures, it's almost as if these were like robots, which off the top of my head I can only think of something vaguely similar to being what happened at Flatwoods 20 years previously. So do you think that's also something that gives this a lot more credence than some stories of that era, that it is so strange, it is so unique, and the descriptions seem to be wholly original? It's not a repressed memory. It's not something they could have caught on TV even if they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, I think that gives it added credibility, is because if somebody was going to lie, they would probably look up what UFO beings look like and how they acted and that sort of thing. Well, like what these people describe is a whole lot different from the normal description, because the normal description is sort of slender things with legs and big eyes and big heads. Well, these were kind of porky type things with a whole lot of wrinkles, and they couldn't even, I don't know if they ever really saw their eyes, and they didn't look anything like, the usual descriptions. And they didn't have legs. They sort of had a pedestal, and they sort of floated on the pedestal and things. And so that, if they were hoaxing, they would probably say something that, was more like everybody else was reporting. And then also, when they were on board, they reported that it was like they were being scanned, and like this thing came out from the wall and circled them. Well, like that's sort of like a CAT scan, except that today in a CAT scan, they put you on a gurney and shove you in a machine, whereas this was this little thing that went around them. And so that, is more, if it was a scan, it was more advanced than they have today.
Do you think the more you discover about this case, the more perplexing it becomes? And it's actually, there's probably far more to this than we ever thought possible now.
Well, one reason that I started on it was because my mother was a skeptic. And I was real surprised when she called up and said, "Did you hear that noise?" And, I told her she was crazy. And she said, she seemed to still be asking me, "Did you hear that noise?" And then she called and said, there was a flap. That was very, very strange for my mother. And that's one thing that sort of turned me on to the whole thing, because that was something it's just weird for her. So I guess that's why I kind of started on that. But the sound is strange, too, because it just didn't match the physics of a regular sonic boom or anything. And I spent more time on the sound than on the rest of it. In fact, when I started interviewing people, I hadn't even read much about the abduction, because I didn't want to, I was afraid if I interviewed people, I'd ask them leading questions or things, and I didn't really even want to know too much about it to start with. Of course, I read it now.
Yeah.
So I sort of entered it from a different angle, but it was still something, they always talk about UFOs and these are flying objects that people see. Well, there was something across the United States then, but nobody saw anything. And that's sort of weird, too. And I suppose it's why nobody paid attention to the sound.
As often can happen when we get situations like this, everybody looks at things on an individual basis. They don't put them together. They don't think that they are connected or ingredients from the same pie, shall we say. Irena, these are individual events, and especially when it's affecting so many states in so many areas, everybody thinks, oh, well, that's a bit weird what's happened here in Ohio, not thinking, well, somebody in Tennessee's thinking exactly the same kind of thing. And yet we have this incident that goes off in Mississippi as well. Is the noise what this craft was? Is that what caused it? Or is that something else? Or is it connected with the other sightings that were going on in other states? And it's tantalizing that now we can look at the bigger picture and just think, what the hell was going on?
Yeah, and the sound was the same time as the abduction. And, for a while I'd just been studying the sound. Then it occurred to me something caused the sound. And maybe this was a UFO. It definitely was, because it wasn't identified, whatever it was. And it certainly produced things because, like, there were actual fire department runs and things like that. People thought their houses were falling in and all kinds of things. There were shattered windows and just a lot of physical effects from it. And then everybody forgot about it the next day, although it was reported in the papers the next day, but the day after, it seemed like everybody forgot about it. And it went over, a big area of the population of the country, plus over Washington, D.C., where there's a lot of observatories and things, too.
Yeah. I take it nobody saw a meteor, because that's often, an excuse for a loud noise that's heard over such a wide vicinity that people would say, oh, it's probably a meteor.
Well, they explain it as a meteor, what they call it, an earth-grazing meteor, one that can actually land. Nobody saw a meteor at all, so there was no reports of anybody seeing a meteor. But they explained it as earth-grazing meteor, and I had enough information I could calculate its velocity, and it was definitely not a meteor, because it was way below what would be needed to be an earth-grazer meteor.
Yeah, I always love an explanation that basically has no evidence for it, but we just know they happen, so therefore that'll do.
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of, I could get a lot from the newspaper reports and the seismograph things and everything and do a good scientific study on it.
Yeah. Well, that's where you've got to start. You've got physical evidence, you've got records, you've got a map of the affected areas. So if you can say, well, the evidence doesn't tally with the explanation, then why do we still accept the explanation when we can prove it's not true?
Well, I don't think anybody did. I think they just accepted what the scientists said. And I don't think the scientists worked on it too hard, because it seemed like 2 days later everybody forgot about it. And I suppose that's because nobody saw anything.
Yeah. I suppose that I would imagine there's still people out there, Irene, who are still talking about that the night they heard that strange noise or something similar, where you never know what might come out of this now. You never know. I think by digging into these situations and these events that occurred during those few weeks, that we know what's gone on with Pascagoula over the last 5 years. Who knows what we could uncover in the next 5?
Yeah. So I was amazed that I was amazed that I could get that much information, and the information didn't agree with the latest information on sonic booms and things like that.
The book just creates so many more questions, because, like I said, when you read it and realise that there is such a chain of events going on in so many different areas, I think it really is a tantalising situation that really belies anything we probably knew. And there's some fantastic tables of events and areas that have been affected in it. The book's got some fabulous photos from the particular time, and you've given us a whole raft of scientific calculations and evidence in regards to debunking the debunkers, as it were, and putting it forward. And I recommend the book highly to anybody who wants to get a deep dive into the surrounding events, because I think the key thing here, Irena, about this is that this book seems to focus on everything else that was going on around Charles and Calvin's incident. And I think when you look at the bigger picture, it is jaw-dropping that it really does make you think, what on earth was going on that month?
Yeah, there was a lot more than reported. There was a lot reported, actually, but I think there's a lot more underneath it all, too.
Well, Irena, thank you so much for giving us an insight into your book and your endeavours to pull this incredible body of work together. Where can everybody get hold of a copy and keep up to date with your work, and if you've got any forthcoming appearances or anything else in the pipeline for us?
Well, thank you. My book's on Amazon.com. It just say Beyond Pascagoula, and you should be able to find it. And I also will be speaking at the UFO Mega Conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, in more detail on everything in March. I think it starts March 19th.
Fabulous. And if anybody's got an incident or a sighting or anything they want to get in touch with you about, what's the best way to send you a message or drop you a line, Irena?
I'm in Facebook, and they can send a message whether they're on Facebook or not. Just my name, Irena Scott, is on Facebook.
Fantastic. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming back. It's always nice when a previous guest wants to come back. Irena, it always makes me smile to know I've not scared you off that much. It's a great book. I commend you highly. It's thoroughly fascinating, and I must admit, when I'd finished reading it, I had far more questions than I thought I would have at the start of it. So thank you again for joining me today, and I wish you all the very best for your upcoming endeavours.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad to be back again.